Hello everyone and welcome to today's exams catch-up webinar. My name is Jenny Mutley-Collins and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Becky East, Ellie Benstead and Stuart Vinnie, who you'll see in the chat throughout the webinar. During the webinar you'll be able to see and hear our speaker, Deb Hobbs. You can see her already, and you'll also be able to see her slides. You won't need a microphone. If you want to chat to each other or interact with Deb during the webinar, please use the chat. And if you want other attendees to see your comments, make sure that you select all panelists and attendees before you post anything in the chat. We'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions for Deb or about any of the content that we've shared, please write these in the Q&A tab, which you should be able to see in your control panel, and we'll answer as many of these as we can after the presentation. Now, the recording of today's webinar will be on our exams catch-up site by next week, and we will email you a copy of your attendance certificate also next week. So, I'm very pleased to welcome Deb as this afternoon's presenter. Deborah Hobbs works in Bristol as a freelance author and instructional designer, and also as an English language lecturer in higher education. She's enjoyed over 10 years of English language teaching, examining and training, and regularly speaks at international teacher training events. She's worked in several countries, including Italy, Spain, China, and Argentina. Deborah holds a DIPTESOL, a postgraduate certificate in online and distance education, and is currently studying from MA ODE, that's Technology Enhanced Learning and Design. And prior to becoming an educator, Deborah was a business change and project manager in financial services. So that should give you a bit of background about today's speaker. So we're looking forward to hearing Deb talk to us today about flipped classroom flexibility. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Deb. Over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Deb, as Jenny said, and for many of us, after lockdown, schools have reopened, but we continue to find ourselves in this flipped classroom, blended or hybrid learning situation. And in this situation, we're working with our students both face-to-face and online. And so in this session, I aim to provide you with some support and ideas for teaching in this new normal. And I'll draw on some online tools and class-based course book materials. And I'll also make some suggestions for using these as springboards for flexible learning. So there'll be time for questions at the end, but please feel free to put things into the chat box as we're going along. I will try and look at the chat box as I'm speaking, but I've got a couple of screens on the go and a few different mouses and the chat. So if I miss something, then I do apologise, and hopefully Jenny will pick some of the comments up later. Okay, so let's just cover briefly what we mean by flipped classroom in case some of you aren't sure. So blended learning then to start. The Cambridge Dictionary suggests that blended learning is learning that combines the traditional classroom lessons with the lessons that use computer-based technology or that are given over the internet. So currently a lot of us as teachers are finding ourselves in this blended learning or hybrid learning situation following the implementation of online teaching during the pandemic. Flipped learning, by comparison, is a pedagogical approach in which this notion of class-based learning is flipped, is inverted. So students are introduced to learning material perhaps before class, And then classroom time is used to deepen the understanding of the material through discussion with peers, discussion with the teacher, problem solving activities facilitated by the teachers. So, for example, students might watch a video for class, they might watch a video of their teacher explaining an exam technique, and then they're ready to practice that technique when they come to class. So the flipped element is often, in a traditional sense, used for pre-teaching, but we're also going to be thinking about it today for post-learning consolidation as well. So there's many reasons why we might choose to flip our classrooms in this way, aside from pandemic necessity. And there are some examples that I've given you on this slide around flexibility. So having access to course materials 24/7 provides flexibility for students with different learning preferences and personal commitments. So it allows us to exploit class-based materials more effectively than we might if we ask students to perhaps complete some more traditional homework in class. And the flexible teaching and learning environment also gives students time to problem solve, as they don't have the time pressures and the immediacy to respond as they might do in class. The other item on there is that it gives us the opportunity to cover material in more depth. And notice here I say in more depth as opposed to additional material, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that a bit later. So flipping the classroom then supports student personalisation. It provides opportunities for self-pacing because students can work at their own speed. And not only is this positive for weaker students who perhaps need or want more time to assimilate new language or exam techniques, but it also supports stronger students. So, for example, fast finishers who need less time to complete their work. And this is quite useful for us when our exam classes are maybe slightly mixed in terms of ability. There are opportunities to provide students with individual support and to help with specific learning difficulties. So, for example, working from home, a student with a visual impairment could use text-to-speech software. And because of this personalisation, the flipped classroom approach is by its very nature quite student-centred. So the flipped classroom then supports active learning. It creates more opportunities for peer-to-peer feedback rather than teacher feedback only. And it encourages more collaboration between students using online tools like Twitter, for example, closed groups like Facebook, and it also focuses on higher order skills, things like critical thinking and evaluation. So there's evidence to suggest that a flipped classroom approach does increase motivation because it encourages students to become autonomous learners. Obviously, they're taking responsibility or more responsibility and ownership for their learning. And in addition, it can provide opportunities for real-world language application after the exam and help students to develop professional skills. So, for example, in a flipped classroom, you might use applications like Microsoft Office, PowerPoint presentations, Google Docs, etc. And all of these students may need for work post-exam. So I don't know if any of you have tried a flipped classroom approach, but absolutely it does come with challenges. And I'd be really interested if you perhaps could put some of your own challenges into the chat, if you have any, as I'm talking about this slide, and I'll have a quick look at the chat afterwards to see if any of you have raised any additional challenges that I didn't think about. So from a teacher perspective, in my personal experience, there is quite a heavy upfront workload prior to class. So, for example, converting exam courses or exam course books to from class-based to flipped approach do require work and thought. And when I say class-based, I mean both face-to-face and online classes. So they're synchronous in that you are with the students at the same time. And of course, if you take that away and the students are working asynchronously, they're working at their own time, then of course there are challenges for the teacher who has a lot of preparation. With regards to finding appropriate classroom materials as well, says Alessandra in the chat, absolutely. So this can be a real challenge. Today, for example, I Googled in my preparation flipped classroom materials, and there's pages and pages of suggestions and advice, but I was really struggling to find specific materials that I could use. From a student perspective, students might be faced with technical issues, they might have problems with connectivity, they may be unable to find somewhere suitable to study, so perhaps there's nowhere quiet for them to study at home. They may not be able to afford the technology that's required for them to work from home. They may have insufficient knowledge about this new method and what's expected of them. They may feel overwhelmed at the thought of having to interact with peers in a way that's not perhaps natural to them in a typical classroom environment. And they may feel that they're just too far outside of their comfort zone. And students who are less organised or have insufficient metacognitive skills, so that's things like their ability to self-regulate, their ability to monitor themselves, their ability to evaluate their learning, they may feel that they are self-teaching and that they're not being taught. And this can be a challenge. They may feel that they're doing all the work for themselves. I'm just going to have a quick look now at the chat to see if there are any other observations coming through. Yeah, time management skills, motivations, I can see on chat, really useful. Unwillingness, absolutely. They may be dependent on the teacher. Yeah, so there's some good comments coming in here. Thank you very much. Okay, so in order to perhaps overcome some of these challenges, I think it's really important before we attempt any sort of classroom environment that we communicate to the students. And what this means is that we need to be clear about what we're doing and why we're doing it. We need to explain to the students why this method is beneficial for their learning. So, for example, to engage active learning, to consolidate learning, to prepare for learning to take place. We need to explain that if they don't do the flip element, so the pre-learning or the post-consolidation, they may not get so much from the class-based lessons. And I think as well, explain that this approach is to save time by reinforcing materials or consolidating materials so that we can spend more time in class on things like problem solving and communicative activities. And as I mentioned before, it's around covering materials in more depth, so exploiting rather than adding to the workload. Okay, so what to flip? Thinking about exam classes specifically, but not necessarily only exam classes. So if you're a general English teacher, I think you could apply these as well. Things that we might flip on the slide there. And the reason why we're thinking about these items is because communicative activities, as I mentioned before, so for example, practice exam speaking parts 1, 2, 3 and 4, practicing your IELTS speaking, for example, these work well in a synchronized setting. So these work well in a class-based setting, either face-to-face or virtually. And so by flipping other activities like grammar presentations, we can free up more time and space to focus on communicative activities when we're with the students. So things like the Grammar on the Move videos that you can see there on the right hand side, I've taken that example from the Open World series from B2 First. These are great for presenting grammar before the lesson. Students, for example, could be tasked to watch the video, complete exercises 1 and 2, and make a list of 2 or 3 points that they are unclear about. And then they can bring that to class so that you can then discuss any problem areas. And the flexibility part here is that these Grammar on the Move videos or grammar presentation videos that you perhaps have created yourself can be accessed and used in multiple ways. So not only in a traditional flipped sense of learning, but also in class, on the big screen, in a virtual classroom, on shared screens like we are today, or as a follow-up consolidation activity to reinforce learning. So students could be tasked with researching something about the exam that they are taking. If you do this, you might want to direct them to official exam websites, but not necessarily. You might tell them to find something out about the exam, marking criteria, for example, about the exam. So how many questions there are in a particular part of the exam. And as teachers, I know that we all have some great ideas about techniques for different parts of the exams that we're teaching. So you could maybe record a 5-minute video outlining or explaining a technique. Don't worry about making the video professional or perfect. The quality doesn't have to be great. Students generally love to watch the teachers in videos. So remember that lots of short videos are better than long ones, so try to keep them to a few 5-10 minutes, perhaps not 90 minutes. Students can watch the video in their own time, and then be tasked with answering a number of concept checking questions or making notes about, I don't know, 3 ideas that they've learned, something like that. Students can then in class discuss their notes, check with you anything that they're not sure about before they then go on to practice the technique. Additionally, there writing workshops, so that's things like perhaps presentation about specific writing elements of an exam, or perhaps peer review. So, for example, students write something in the class and then they can take home someone else's work to review it in their own time, in this sort of flipped consolidation approach, and then come back to class the next day and discuss with each other 3 things that they did well, that their classmate did well in their writing, and 1 thing that they might be able to improve. The real world language practice there, that's things like functional language. So, for example, you might in class go through some vocabulary, coffee shop ordering, buying something, complaining, I know comes up quite a lot in the exam, and then they could go to a coffee shop in the real world and perhaps, hopefully not complain about something, but perhaps. I'm just having a quick look at the chat. Idea, it takes time for students to get used to flipped lessons. However, once they become familiar, it's quite useful. Yes, it does take time. I absolutely agree with you 100%. And I think it's really important that we're really clear with the students about why we're doing what we're doing, and then give them time to work through it. I think they need to really see that there's benefit, and then you get the buy-in from the students, and then can continue. So what not to flip before we move on? As I mentioned, communicative activities, so for example, exam speaking practice, or I tend to prefer to do those in class or in a face-to-face environment with the students. You might get the students to argue for and against a particular exam technique, a reading technique or a writing technique in the class. Remember though that from a flipped perspective, because we're thinking about flexibility today, they could record themselves answering an exam question before the class or as a consolidation activity after class, and then in class perhaps you could, I mean, I've done this before, it has worked well. So the students recorded themselves answering an exam question, and then we watched the videos of their recordings in class, and all of us together as a group provided feedback. That took a bit of getting used to. Peer-to-peer feedback isn't something that's perhaps natural for students, but it worked really, really well. Planning answers to exam writing questions, you may prefer to do those in class. There are collaborative tools, Padlet I've seen mentioned in the chat, Mentimeter, for example, where students could collaboratively plan an answer to an exam question, but you may prefer not to flip that until you feel that it's been fully scaffolded. One other thing I tend not to flip is when I ask students to write exam questions for their peers. Again, this is because it's a really useful activity. However, it can be quite challenging for students. So I tend to prefer teacher support here, at least until the students have got used to the way of doing this, and then perhaps they could do that in their own time, collaboratively, using Padlet or something, or on their own. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about using coursebook materials to flip. This is an example here of a book material taken from the Open World series. We can see here that in class it's part of a speaking part 3 activity, and then the flipped element here could be the real world consolidation, which is describing or introducing yourself, perhaps to a stranger, maybe someone waiting on the bus stop, perhaps a student from another class. In this environment at the moment of lockdown, it could be an online activity, a collaborative activity. But this is a way that you perhaps can use your coursebook materials to springboard into activity. Here's another one. This is an example of life competencies, again taken from the Open World series. So this could be an in-class activity here, it could be a flipped pre-learning activity, or it could be a post-class collaborative activity. So here we can see the life competencies with job advertisements. In-class exam practice might be writing a letter of application, depending on the exam your students are taking. The flipped element, the out-of-class real-world consolidation, could be an online job search. Students might make notes then about how they might, the relevant skills that they've got to apply for the job. They perhaps then come back to class and maybe role play job interviews then before writing the letter of application, if you were going to do it that way around. I'd be interested here if you wanted to add any of your own activity ideas. There's a list here that I'll run through with you, but please in the chat, if you want to add anything, please do. So these are some ideas of, well, I would hope that these ideas are quite flexible. So you could potentially use most or some of them as either pre-learning flipped opportunities, so pre-learning opportunities, or post-learning consolidation. That might be, here are some ideas, a collaborative wiki to create an exam advice sheet for new students. This could be teacher-led or student-led, depending on whether or not you wanted to make it a pre-learning or post-learning consolidation. YouTube video to explain a grammatical structure. So as I said before, students love to see their teacher. You could use this, you could use pre-recorded content. You could ask students to create their own videos. The latter is useful if you're using it as a post-learning consolidation. YouTube video to demonstrate correct or incorrect body language. So I did this before with eye contact or arms going everywhere. So that might be modelling good posture or body language in a speaking exam. Have some fun, I think, with that one. A learning journal. So that's a blog or a web. Students can use this to internalise their learning, and it's also great. You know, you can get to know your students if they're sort of writing a journal or diary. Perhaps you might have a private diary where it's just between you and the student, or it could be a group diary. Creating blogs. That might be students interviewing other exam students about why they're taking the exam, what they intend to do with their English language skills once they've passed the exam. Padlet we've mentioned a few times now, so collecting information about their exam concerns, that could be a useful pre-learning activity. Flipped class, in-class flipped stations. Now I don't know if you've heard about this before, but this is an idea where you section off areas of the class, so where students can do the flipped part of the class, so the home part, but actually in the class. So Martha Ramirez has a blog which explains this in more detail, but it's flexible in that you can have sections of the class that could be used for class finishers, a section that can be used for peer-to-peer feedback, a section that could be used for practice, another section that might be used for the pre-learning, so perhaps watching videos using earplugs, etc. So space might be an issue on this one, but it is worth taking a look at the blog if you're interested in it. Functional language, so introducing yourself, asking for directions, ordering, complaining in a restaurant, researching, common language errors, so first conditional, produce a presentation, alone or in groups using a collaborative tool, and then present and discuss plans. So those are just a few flipped activity ideas. If you do have any more that you would like to put into the chat, then please do. If there's anything else that anyone can think of, I'll just pause for a moment and let you have a look at the slide, and I will have a glass of water. Okay, nothing in chat? So Mariam likes number 9. Yeah, I quite like number 9. I've done that before in class a few times. It's worked quite well, really. This idea of researching. There's lots online, isn't there, about common errors, either with a grammar point or perhaps with specific nationalities. And so that's actually really helpful, because if you're thinking about your own nationality and the errors that you make with English, then you can present that to the rest of the class quite well. Instructions for engaging in future discussion in class. Yeah, that's a good one. Videos from BBC Learning English. Yeah, that's great. Also, what's the other one? British Council have some really useful, some good information as well that you could use. Students can do a survey on different topics and report them in class. Absolutely. I'm so sorry, I can't pronounce your name, but thank you very much. Shared BBC interviews, mini English lessons. Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm going to move on. So these, now I'm going to just mention some collaborative tools. So this is an online collaborative tool, mindomo.com. And these are quite good for asynchronous student collaboration. So this one was pre-populated with parts of speech. And then I asked the students then to write example sentences, which I then responded to. So there's one example there from Tom, who gave his permission for us to use his sentence today. So the demonstrative this and these, and he wrote, "This exam is hard." It was. So Menti.com, absolutely. That's another one that's just popped up from Svetlana. Again, I apologise for my pronunciation, Svetlana. So yeah, Menti.com. Notices that teacher, that was me, moderates and provides feedback. So it's really important if you use these asynchronous collaborative tools that there is some sort of teacher present. Evidence, there is evidence to suggest that student motivation does drop if the teacher doesn't dip in and out. Okay, so this is another example here of some postcast consolidation that I did using TED.com. This was a pre-sessional university course. It wasn't an exam course. However, I think you could still use it in the same way. Notice that I used colours there, and that the steps, so the instructions to the students, are numbered. It's quite useful to get into the habit of numbering your stages, so that students are really clear about what's expected of them. And also notice the use of verbs at the start or toward the start of each step, so that again students are really clear about what's required of them. If possible, I didn't do it here, but if possible, always tell students how long that they should spend on the task. You can see here that you've got the student responding, and then I've again stepped in and provided feedback and responded to the student. Mindomo.com. Shall I just write that in the chat? So I've got a question there in the chat. What's the name of the first collaborative tool? I'm just going to type that into the chat a second for you before I forget. There we go. Have you got that? Mindomo.com. And as I said, the parts of speech, Minds Math was already populated. This one on the screen now was my university's tool. So this is Blackboard Learn, but I guess you could set this up with wikis, or you could even set this up on a Facebook page, something like that. Google Docs, you could set it up on. So here now we have some online tools. TED Talks is up there. I haven't actually put TED Talks as an online tool, but you will see that there is the turn YouTube and TED Talks content into structured digital lessons using EdTED. So I'll just leave you for a moment to have a look at the online tools. I know that the slides will be available after the session, but you might want to take a photograph. Or so there's the list: interactive mind maps, interactive collaborative experiences, collaborative content, pre-record presentation and instructions, YouTube and TED Talks with EdTED, EdTed's quite good. It does it, although you're using, you might use a YouTube or TED Talks that's not been created by you, so it's not particularly personalised. The ability, the lesson that you can create is personalised. So that's quite a nice one. I'm just going to allow a moment for you to have a look at these and perhaps make any comments in the chat or add any other online tools that you can think of and share with each other. That would be really, really helpful and collaborative of us before we move on. Okay. So here then are some do's and don'ts, or don'ts and do's. So don't go over exactly the same material in the class-based lesson, whether that's online, whether it's virtual, whether it's face-to-face, as you did in the flipped part of the lesson. So the pre-learning or the post-consolidation. Otherwise, the students will stop doing it. They'll stop doing the pre-learning if you're going to cover exactly the same material when you get into class. Instead, use the class time to develop ideas, test students' understanding, develop understanding and answer questions by focusing on problem areas. You may be tempted, I certainly was tempted to, and I did do this, to see the pre-learning as an opportunity to increase the amount of content I was giving to the students. So I saw it initially as a way to do more in less time. Don't do this. Keep the same content, but use the flipped element, the flipped approach to reinforce the teaching, to develop the understanding and to increase the learning that way. In my experience, I simply, when I tried to use it as an opportunity to give them more content, the students became overwhelmed and they actually learned less. And finally, the flipped pre-learning or post-consolidation means nothing if you don't do anything with it in class. So students will stop doing it if they can't see a reason for doing it. So don't abandon all the hard work that you've done, all the preparation that you did, and do nothing with it. So as a minimum, ensure that there's some sort of live class-based discussion, and the same for the post-consolidation. So whenever you're doing the extra work, whether it's before class or after class, do something with it. Okay, finally then some do's. Do use quizzes in class to test understanding. Give reasons to watch videos. So never just say, watch this video before class. Give a clear reason to watch the video. So that might be including things like concept checking questions, making notes of key points, making notes of anything that they didn't understand, but always give reasons. Provide clear instructions and clear aims. Show links to the class-based activities. Include expected time to complete, set any deadlines. You might say something simply like, spend about 30 minutes on this task. Spend between 20 and 40 minutes on this task. Give background resources and links. So if you're asking the students to do some research, it's a really good idea to provide them with 1 or 2 examples of websites they could use, and that will help springboard them to do their own research, but provide them with something so that there's some scaffolding. Have a numbered list of steps when you give instructions. Start each step with a verb, so write, watch, develop, estimate, and do monitor and provide feedback if you're using online collaborative tasks. So although students may be working asynchronously, dip in and out and provide feedback and support, and just show them that you're there. So make sure that you are a continual presence in that process. Okie dokie, so that's all I think I wanted to cover. I know that I talked at you a lot, so hopefully you managed, I didn't go too fast, but if you do have any questions, I'd be absolutely thrilled to answer them.
Yes, thank you, Deb. That was really interesting session with lots of really good tips there. Just a message for attendees, just a reminder that we'll send you your attendance certificate by email in the next few days. Now, if you've got any questions for Deb, you can start thinking about those and typing them in the Q&A box. And I can see we already have some in there, but yeah, start having a think about what you would like Deb to answer. In the meantime, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about some of the materials that we have to help support you in your teaching, particularly in flipped learning. So Deb, if you wouldn't mind popping it onto the next slide for me.
Yes, of course. Sorry, I was just looking at the questions as well. So hopefully when I click a button, it will go in the right direction. Let's just see where my mouse is. Right, here we go.
Yeah, and then the one after it as well. You can.
Okay, there we go. You want the one after as well?
Yes, please. Thank
there
you.
We go.
All right, lovely. So this is just to tell you a little bit about Open World, which is the new exam series from Cambridge. It's the course that takes you further. And this course is great for combining general English with exam preparation, and it's suitable for school ages and older. We have a new level of this course this year, which is C1 Advanced. You can see it's the big one there. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Lovely. And Compact First, which is available from this month, it's another new course which offers some of that flipped classroom flexibility. Both Compact and Open World have got QR grammar animations, which are really good for, Deb mentioned them, they're really good for part of this flipped classroom approach. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and all of our new courses this year come with the Cambridge One digital pack, which is our brand new digital offer. The key feature of this is that all of your teaching and learning resources are in one place. And you can see on the screen there all of the features that come with it: ebook, practice extra, test generator, test and train, which is exam practice. Obviously the QR animation videos, where relevant, are also part of this digital pack. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So you're watching this webinar as part of our exams catch-up series, which is running live until the 5th of May. And on the next slide, you should be able to see we have another webinar with Deb Hobbs. So if you have enjoyed this, look out for her next one. It is on the 5th of May, and she'll be talking about reinventing the tip box. So let's perhaps start taking a look at the questions.
Okay.
Do you want to pick a question, or shall I?
Yeah, so I can. I mean, I've just noticed that Anna has asked, she tried to reach the Martha Ramirez blog, but it doesn't work. So I was just frantically Googling for you, Anna. If you go into flippedlearning.org, I'm just going to put that into chat, flippedlearning.org, you should be able to find it there. So flippedlearning.org. Should be where you will find the Martha Ramirez blog.
Yeah, I will just pop that URL in the chat for you so that you can see that. All right, lovely. Thank you, Deb. We've got a question from Leticia Pacheco, I hope I pronounced that correctly, saying, what is the best technique to encourage students for peer working in a flipped lesson? So there you go. What do you think?
So I've done a couple of things. So one was, as I think I mentioned, around taking home their classmates' writing work. So they wrote, I think it was one of the exams in class. I think this was IELTS I was teaching, and then they took their classmates' writing home with some checklist questions. So have you written the right number of words? Have you included an introduction, a main body paragraph, and a conclusion? And then they effectively, they didn't mark their students' work, but they went through the checklist to see if their classmate had covered all of the items in the checklist. And then when we came back to class, we discussed it as a teacher-led session. So I did that with writing. Another thing might be a collaborative tool. So you could use a collaborative tool, say perhaps something like Google Docs. So maybe the student puts some writing on Google Docs, and then they're in small groups and they make comments. So usually I would say find 3 things that your classmate did well, and 1 thing they could improve and how they could improve it. So be really specific about the questions you're asking. Don't just say, what did they not do very well, or what could they improve? Make sure that you include the things that they did really well first, and then maybe 1 thing that could be improved. And you could focus on target language, linking language, specific phrasal verbs, or something that you covered in class.
Great, thank you. Anna Herrera is asking, what do you think about flipping the warm-up? I asked my students to prepare a playlist so we could discuss likes and preferences when it comes to music at the beginning of class. Is this still considered warm-up or content?
I really like that idea, actually, Anna. I'm assuming that the students prepared the playlist as pre-learning, and then you discuss the preferences in class. Yeah, I would say that's absolutely pre-learning, and then the discussion part, the playing the music and discussing the music would be what you did in class, and I think that's great. Really good idea.
Yeah. Okay. What else have we got here in the questions? Of course, do carry on typing in your questions. We've got a few minutes left if anybody would like to ask anything. Alexandra Ferreira is saying, what if you want to use class time to consolidate pre-learning and some of the students haven't done it? That's happened to me, and I ended up going over the material again, which was frustrating for the ones who had done it.
Absolutely.
Always an issue, I suppose.
Yeah, and I've had exactly the same thing, and that's one of the reasons why we were talking about, make sure students see, that the need to do the pre-work. Now, I mean, it's controversial, really, because what I've done in class before, I'm a bit like, you know, 2 strikes and you're out. So what I mean by out is not out the class, but I don't go over the pre-work. So if the student hasn't completed the pre-work and there's no real reason why they weren't able to do that, then I've not gone over it again in class, because the rest of the class have done it, and I think that for me it would undermine what the other students have done, and also it would undermine what we're trying to do in the class. So yeah, I feel your frustration, absolutely, and I think you need to obviously manage that how you feel it should be managed. But for me, or after 1 or 2 times, I didn't. I stopped and I said I won't go through. If you don't do the pre-work, I'm not going to go through it in class again. Yeah. Hardline teacher approach.
That's the tough approach. Actually, Rosalind has just said in the chat, we could also get the ones who've done it to explain it to the others. So that's one way, I suppose, a middle way. and she's also said, I sometimes put them in the dones and not dones and give them different activities for the first activity. So again, the way.
Yeah. I mean, I've done that before. I've put if they didn't do it, I've put them in, you know, put the students in the naughty corner to do the homework or the flipped work. But yeah, I mean, I try. I think the problem is if you stop the lesson and you do the pre-work again, then you're undermining everything you're trying to do, and the students that were doing the pre-work will just stop because they can't see the benefit of doing it. Tough love. Alessandra agrees with me. Yeah, tough love.
Well, you could argue, you know, it happens once and it wouldn't happen again. Obviously, it depends on the students, but
and I guess, you know, it depends on the situation, doesn't it? I mean, I do try and make sure that they can contact me if there's any issues. If they've not told me there's a reason why they can't do it, then I would go into class and expect it to
be done. Yeah. Okay. Perhaps they've got a question here from Nikolai Krasikov, and he's saying, thank you, obviously, for the webinar. Do you think a game imitating a real life situation in class is a good idea? So you did talk about real life English as one of the parts you could flip. So again, it's a question how you might bring that into this approach.
So I guess when you say game, I'm thinking you mean sort of like a role play type activity or a game. Because absolutely, I think. I mean, I try to keep real life as possible. I mean, of course, sometimes there's role play. So I mentioned interviews, but before now, real life in class. An example I can think of was that we telephoned businesses to ask about opening hours and things like that. So the pre-work was language to do with opening hours, etc. And then in class, the students started by telephoning each other, and I put them into different rooms. So they were calling each other on their mobile phones, and then we came back into class, and then they telephoned local businesses to ask about opening hours, so museums and things like that. And the students they did it one at a time, obviously, but they put the call on loudspeaker so that we could hear both sides of the conversation. It was a bit nerve-wracking, but once 1 or 2 students were successful, everybody really got into it. So that was an example, I guess, of bringing real life into the classroom. But it was real life. It wasn't role play. Well, we did both. We did role play first and then real life. Telephone calls are tricky, aren't they, for students?
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Deb. I think that's pretty much all we've got time for today. So thank you to everybody who has attended. We hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. As we've said, don't forget to check our events page for details of the upcoming webinars, and in particular Deb's, if you've enjoyed this one. The recording of today's webinar will be live on the exams catch-up page by next week. And thank you again to Deb. Thank you. It's been really interesting, really useful. Lots of takeaway tips there. So yes.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me and us today. Thank you. I hope to see you, when is it, 5th of May?
Yeah, thank you again, and thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your days, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.